Having only recently played Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, I was blown away by how good that game is even 7 years later. And with Senua's Saga Hellblade II only just around the corner, I think we are in for a really special game with how much improvement Ninja Theory seemed to be making in the lead up to this game. Now, a lot of you guys may not have played the first game, and so today, without talking spoilers, I'm going to be talking a little bit about Hellblade 1 and what you guys can expect for the second installment coming out later this month. Now, the first thing that this game offers in absolute bundles is immersion. It is one of the most immersive games that I think I've ever played in all my probably 15 to 20 years of playing games now. The key part of that is to do with the sound design. The sound design in Hellblade 1 was absolutely insane, and it's only going to be better in Hellblade 2. There are constant voices in your head either helping you or sometimes even deterring you from what you're doing, putting you down and saying that you can't get past this puzzle or you're going to die in combat and stuff like that. And it does start to really mess with your head, adding even further to that immersion. Something that adds to that even further too is to do with the camera angle and just the closeness that this game gives you. It feels like you are constantly right there with Senua, if not making you feel like you are Senua yourself. Whether you are just walking through a landscape or fighting in combat, the closeness of this game is definitely one of the other key parts of the immersion, and it's something that I've never really seen done to this quality level in many other games out there. It really does make you feel like you are right there and that you're part of the story. Something else that helps a lot with the immersion is the seamless transitions from gameplay to cutscenes. If you guys have played a game like God of War, it is much the same as that, where it'll go straight from combat to instantly being in a cutscene, and you can't really tell that you've actually gone into a cutscene straight away. And at least for me personally, that does really help with the immersion because it kind of feels like everything is flowing super smooth. There's no like loading screens and stuff like that, and it just feels like something is pretty much always happening within the story. Now, speaking of the story and mostly also the setting and the length, because like I said, I'm not going to really get into spoilers or anything like that, but something you guys can expect with this game, which I'm sure a lot of you would know already, is that Hellblade is a much shorter experience than most games. The first game only took me about 8 or 9 hours to beat, and to be honest, if you tried to speedrun it, you could probably do it in 7 or so hours. So it is a much shorter game, and a lot of people will probably see that as a bad thing. A lot of discourse I see on the internet is essentially the longer the game, the better, because you're getting more content. And while I can sort of understand that point of view, I don't necessarily agree with that at all. And that's coming from someone who loves those 100-hour experiences like Red Dead 2, Skyrim, recently with Dragon's Dogma, for example. I do love those longer games, but honestly, this game being shorter, it did actually make it feel like a much higher quality game. Sometimes with those longer games, it means that there are sort of areas that get less love than others. And so you might go through certain sections of the game or maybe a certain part of the map, even sometimes just certain mechanics like the combat or something like that, that do feel like they received a little bit less love than other areas simply because it is such a massive project that the team is undertaking. Yet with a smaller experience like this, it does feel like everything is kind of knitted together perfectly, with everything being really smooth and fluid and every sort of mechanic or element of the game being really high quality. So the combat is really good, the story is really good, the sound design is really immersive, and the cinematics are top notch as well, and it all just blends together absolutely perfectly, which I think you can't really get with any game that is longer than about a 25-hour experience. The other good thing about a shorter experience is that each step of the story does feel so well crafted and essentially crucial to what's going on in the story. There are exactly 0 filler moments throughout the game because they've only got such a short window to tell this story. And so it pretty much feels like from the very first minute of the game until it ends, it is just absolute chaos the entire way through. And that is a really nice breath of fresh air compared to a lot of longer games out there that can't really offer that experience. Now, before we go any further, if you guys are new to the channel and you are interested in more Hellblade 2 content, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications. There's plenty more content on the way, so make sure you don't miss out. Now, when it comes to the combat, what you can expect in Hellblade is some very, very solid combat. The combat in Hellblade 1 was also really solid, but it is very basic, and that is worth knowing. It isn't a super deep combat system where there's a heap of different mechanics and stuff like that. Realistically, the combat is a light and heavy attack, a block/parry system, and then essentially a melee attack to kick enemies and break their shields and just throw them off balance in general. That is pretty much all there is to the combat. And although that might sound bad, that there's not too much to it, again, it is such a high quality because they've only got so many areas to focus on. They don't have 50 different mechanics with the combat that they've got to try and perfect. And it means that although very basic, it works very, very well. Now, with that being said, they have essentially overhauled it in Hellblade 2, so it could be a little bit different, but I would imagine the controls and stuff are still of a more basic nature and will essentially be the same as the first game. I don't think they're going to change too much from the first game because it really did work very well. But again, keep that in mind that they have overhauled the combat completely. It is pretty much built from the ground up and it looks even more immersive and realistic than it did in the first game. Just because the combat is more, I guess, shallow and basic, like I said, that does not mean that it's bad. I think it played really well in the first game. I was actually blown away by how good it was because I wasn't really expecting it to be that solid. And looking at the combat from the trailers and the gameplay that we have of the sequel, it looks like it's going to be so fluid and genuinely realistic. I've seen a heap of comments of people saying they thought the combat was actually just a cinematic, not that it was actual gameplay, because that is how fluid and realistic it looks when you are playing. And it was even like that in the first game. So considering they've overhauled it, I think it's going to be even better in Hellblade 2, and I cannot wait to get my hands on it. Now, something else to expect is that there are a lot of puzzles in Hellblade. So if puzzles aren't really your thing, you might not enjoy this game as much as you're probably hoping. Now, with that being said, I do think the puzzles are done really well. At least in Hellblade 1, they were really solid. There are a lot of mind-bending puzzles that kind of implement elements of your surrounding that at first glance just don't look like they're part of a puzzle. You might enter a room and it just looks like a normal room, but you quickly realize it's actually got hidden elements that are pretty much hidden in plain sight that are part of a larger puzzle, and you don't know that until you actually begin the puzzle. Now, the only downside, in my opinion, in the first game is that a lot of the puzzles were a little bit samey. It did feel like I was kind of doing the same type of puzzle over and over again. Now, they were still unique in their own right, but you do sort of have to do the same thing for a lot of them. Not necessarily all of them. There were definitely multiple types of puzzles, and early in the game there was actually quite a few that it felt like none of them were really the same. But once you get to kind of the middle of the first game, it does feel like you're kind of doing a lot of the same thing over and over. Not that that is necessarily bad, because it is still pretty challenging when it comes to what those puzzles entail. And even though the goal is essentially the same, they are obviously still very different to each other. So I don't think the puzzles are bad by any means, but I did just want to mention that a lot of the puzzles in that game were a little bit samey. And from what I've heard from like the IGN reports on this game and stuff like that, that is potentially going to be another issue in this game, that we're going to be doing a lot of the same types of puzzles rather than every single puzzle being completely unique. The final thing you should expect when it comes to Hellblade is that this game is very deep when it comes to essentially the purpose of the story that they're telling. It obviously heavily involves psychosis and just general mental health issues. It really makes you question what's real and what's not in the game. You don't know which parts of the story are actually happening and which parts of them are just happening in Senua's head. And on top of that, it does also make you think about the bigger picture and what people in real life with psychosis must have to go through because of the way that it is portrayed in Hellblade. Now, obviously, video games are never going to be absolutely realistic, but Ninja Theory did work very closely with not only professors who work closely with psychosis, but also people who have psychosis themselves. And they've essentially gotten a lot of experience from both of those parties and implemented them into this game. So like I said, it's never going to be completely realistic, but it does give you somewhat of a good picture of what it must be to live with psychosis. And yeah, what I'll say is that because of that, the story is quite brutal, to be honest. It is a somewhat terrifying experience of a game because it is so real and raw. And this is definitely not the type of game that is all sunshine and roses and everything's fun. It is a pretty brutal and dark story, which for me personally really adds to the experience. But yeah, it is definitely a game that makes you think a hell of a lot. So that is what you guys can roughly expect when it comes to Senua's Saga Hellblade 2 coming out later this month, considering it will be relatively similar to the first game. There is plenty more content on the way, guys, so keep your eyes peeled. And like I said, if you are new to the channel, be sure to subscribe with those notifications on. But with that being said, thank you all very much for watching. You guys have a great day, and I'll catch you all in the next one.